And really diving in, I wanted to thank the Chicago chapter of the Embodied Carbon Network for inviting me to present today. That is my picture right there. Sorry you can't see me today, but I work at Environmental Systems Design as a sustainability consultant. At Environmental Systems Design, I work within our energy and eco group. It's about 10 years old. We do everything from LEED certifications to energy modeling to commissioning and energy audits. And more recently, we've been diving more into life cycle analysis or embodied carbon analysis, because what we're here to do and what you are here to do is reduce CO2 emissions to combat climate change. What I've been seeing over the past 5 years, or what my experience has been, is that I've worked on net zero projects in the past, mainly out in the Middle East, that have wanted to achieve net zero carbon emissions. And so we were looking at both operational carbon to reduce energy consumption, and we were looking at embodied carbon to reduce the carbon emissions from the materials that we selected. Way back 5 years ago, we were looking at carbon cure when it was in its initial rollout phase. And then flash forward to the year 2020, I've been seeing more of a demand about embodied carbon thanks to LEED v4 and LEED v4.1. So now that LEED v4 is like the required version of LEED to register under, there is a credit that I'm going to touch on lightly towards the end of the presentation that has helped gather some interest from clients requesting life cycle analysis. But unfortunately, what I think is going to happen, especially with coronavirus and budgets being a little bit tighter moving forward, is that projects might not be pursuing LEED certification. And so there's going to be perhaps a slight dip in the request for life cycle analysis because it's no longer needed for a LEED point since they're not pursuing LEED certification. So this presentation is all about what you can do outside of LEED to encourage your client to pursue a life cycle analysis. And really what that's all about is to help them meet their CO2 reduction goals, whether it's a corporation or a future law set by the city or state or government. And so that's why I'm here today, is to give you this forecast on where embodied carbon is heading and how we can take advantage of the trajectory that I'm seeing. So our agenda today, which you saw in the invite, has 4 topics. The first one is, what impact does embodied carbon have on reducing global CO2 emissions to help us meet the Paris Climate Agreement? Number 2, what cities and corporations are considering embodied carbon to achieve their CO2 reduction goals? These 2 top things are very important. I also want to touch on, when will embodied carbon reduction become a code requirement? And finally, how do I educate my developer client to reduce embodied carbon, and how will it help them meet their carbon reduction goals? And so really, instead of us being the one that's telling them to do embodied carbon analysis for like a LEED point, it's turning the tables and being like, hey, this analysis can actually help you meet your carbon reduction goals as a corporation. To wrap up, Miguel's going to lead a Q&A where we will be going over any questions asked within the chat section. If we were meeting in person, this would be more of a discussion, but unfortunately, we're not. However, before I dive into the content any further, do we want to do a poll, Miguel?
So we've decided to move the poll and Q&A to the ending.
Okay.
Please put any questions that you have or comments during the presentation in the chat, and we'll address them at the end. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. So what you're about to see is a lot of content, but to narrow your focus, and it's a lot of great content, these are the things you're going to want to remember or maybe jot down so that you know what to focus on You kind of know what I'm saying. So number one, by the year 2030, embodied carbon will account for 74% of total emissions from all buildings constructed after 2020. In the past, that percentage has been 11%, and so we're going to see an increase of embodied carbon having a greater impact on overall CO2 emissions based on the buildings we're working on and operating. Number two, over the period of a year of operations at a building, there are different things that are emitting carbon. The ones that we have thought about in the past is our emissions from energy consumption. That's considered scope 2. But as architects and engineers, we don't think about the scope 3 emissions. Those are the emissions that happen when the client purchases a product or service. And so when a client creates their corporate social sustainability report or an ESI report, they're actually tracking scope 3 emissions as well. And it turns out that those scope 3 emissions most of the time exceed their scope 2 emissions. And so the purchases of different products and services over the course of the year are actually sometimes exceeding the CO2 emitted just by energy. The nice thing is that embodied carbon falls under scope 3. And finally, the presentation will highlight embodied carbon's role in achieving the Paris Climate Agreement and really helping our clients meet their annual carbon reduction goals, specifically the scope 3, or the products that they're purchasing. And so to begin, we're going to talk about embodied carbon's impact on meeting the Paris Climate Agreement. So like I was saying before, currently per Architecture 2030, 11% of global CO2 emissions are tied to building materials and construction or embodied carbon, while 28% is tied to building operations and energy consumption. However, by the year 2030, that number is going to grow from 11% to 74% according to Architecture 2030. Why is this? As buildings meet higher performance standards and the grid becomes greener, operational carbon will continue to decrease and embodied carbon will represent an increasingly large percentage of total life cycle emissions. So what does that look like? In a lovely graph from Architecture 2030, it looks like this. So at the bottom left, we're at year 2020, the building was just constructed, and over the course of 30 years, it's going to be operational, it's going to be running and consuming energy. So that's what we see at the top. It's an exponential growth based on energy consumption over 30 years on how much CO2 is emitted. But down here at the bottom, the embodied carbon, or how much carbon was emitted just by purchasing the products to build that building, is stagnant because it is emitted when those products are created and transported. And so that carbon is always in the air. And because our buildings are going to be more energy efficient in the future, embodied carbon is going to be playing a larger role or a greater impact on overall CO2 emissions from a building's life cycle. And sadly, the other thing that I want to close out with on this section is that in order to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement, the world needs to get to net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050. Another source from Architecture 2030, as we can see below. We're not on track to meet the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement currently, unless the world gets to net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050. That's because we didn't really meet the AIA 2030 commitment currently by the year 2030. So those incremental kind of milestones haven't been met. Because of that, we just need to up our game. We need to think of other ways to reduce overall CO2 emissions, and that's why embodied carbon is going to be playing more of a bigger role in the future to help us meet the Paris Climate Agreement goal by the year 2050. What I wanted to provide next is just a breakdown between net zero energy and net zero carbon. Most of us on the phone are very familiar with what net zero energy is. And what that is that however much energy your building is consuming, you're offsetting any CO2 emissions related to energy consumption, either through on-site or off-site renewable energy, or RECs. However, to meet the Paris Climate Agreement goals by 2050, we need to start thinking about net zero carbon or decarbonization. And so what that brings in is both the energy consumption or the emissions from energy consumption and the emissions from purchases like construction material. This can be, you can achieve net zero carbon in two ways. You can either do a life cycle analysis and reduce the overall impact on the materials are having on CO2 emissions, or you can also purchase carbon offsets, just like RECs. On a project that I've worked on, this is what net zero energy versus net zero carbon looks like. And so you always have a project that's consuming X amount of energy based on the energy model. And then you think about strategies to bring your project to net zero energy, or you're generating enough energy to power the building throughout the year. What net zero carbon is looking at is it's bringing in those construction materials that Miguel was talking about at the start to achieve, to really realize how much CO2 the project emitted over operations and construction of the building. And so this is what a net zero carbon project or graph would look like, is that there's this balance, like there's this zero out of greenhouse gases. And so if the Paris Climate Agreement, or meeting it by the year 2050, wasn't enough with embodied carbon's role in meeting that objective, we can see what cities and corporations have become signatories to reduce their embodied carbon to achieve their own CO2 reduction goals. There are two different platforms that clients or cities can sign onto to commit to reducing their CO2 emissions through embodied carbon. The first one is the World Green Building Council. The first objective here, if you sign on, is by the year 2030, your net zero energy and operating emissions. But then by the year 2050, your net zero carbon. And so what we can see at the US level is that there's one state signed on to this agreement, there's 9 US cities, and 46 global companies. And so, believe it or not, there's already people out there, whether it's a company or city or state, that have signed on to seriously achieving net zero carbon by the year 2050. And the nice thing about the World Green Building Council's commitment is that there's a verification component that we can see over to the right. The other program that companies specifically can sign on to is called the Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees Celsius. This directly relates to the Paris Climate Agreement. It was created by the UN Global Compact. And since its creation, there are over 200 major companies that have signed on to meeting or to help meeting the Paris Climate Agreement. They represent over $2.3 trillion in market value. They represent, their annual emissions combined are equivalent to 73 coal plants. And out of those 200 companies, 26 of them are US based. And so when a client or a corporation signs on to this business ambition for 1.5 degrees Celsius, they have two options to meet the commitment. The first one is to meet the agreements of the Paris Climate Agreement. And what you can see down here is across all relevant scopes, And so what this means is that if their scope 3 emissions over the course of the year exceed 40% of the total emissions of the building, then they do have to bring in embodied carbon calculations, or they do have to bring in their scope 3 emissions. If the building happens to be like a data center, for example, and that data center is consuming a ton of energy, then they might not need to look at their scope 3 emissions. However, if you're a data center client like Microsoft that has signed on to a commitment to be net zero carbon by the year 2030, I believe, but don't take my word for that. They're going for option 2, where they are going to reach net zero value chain emissions by no later than 2050. So what are value chain emissions? It is all that we can see here. The value chain happens to be scope 3, and the purchases are either made before the building is built or during operations. So when we look at embodied carbon, it's purchased goods and services at the upstream level before the building was built. And so if I circle back to this slide, embodied carbon would play a role under option 2 here to reach net zero value chain emissions no later than the year 2050. And then what we can see here is that our clients have a lot of things to consider to reduce their scope 3 emissions. Embodied carbon is only a piece of that. But what we can see from this graph is that scope 3 emissions traditionally represent more than 50% of a client's overall CO2 emissions. And so remember, electricity consumption was scope 2, and in some cases, it's a lot lower than the scope 3 emissions. And so embodied carbon, even to date, could be playing a more significant role. And since a lot of our audience members are Chicago residents, I did want to just provide what Illinois and Chicago is doing. Are they looking at making embodied carbon reduction a code requirement to help them meet their Paris Climate Agreement goals? The answer is no, unfortunately. Illinois and Chicago are mainly focusing on renewable energy to help them meet the Paris Climate Agreement goals, whether it's statewide or citywide. And that's okay, because what they're seeing is that energy consumption in their case is higher than their scope 3 emissions, probably because we're in a cooler climate and we do consume more energy just to operate our buildings. So when will embodied carbon become a code requirement, or embodied carbon reduction become a code requirement? Currently, there are no federal laws tied to embodied carbon reduction or a tax on carbon, but we do predict that there will be carbon taxes in the future. New York City, for example, is already going to have a carbon tax on existing buildings over 25,000 square feet, and fines are going to start in the year 2024. And so if an existing building of that size in New York does not meet certain greenhouse gas reduction goals by the year 2030, they're going to be fined. But those fines won't start until 2024. So those buildings have 4 years to meet that local law, or that law adopted by New York City. There are some states and jurisdictions or that are actually looking at placing embodied carbon reduction into law. And so starting in 2017 in California, there was a law signed in that any building or any state agency or state-funded projects like a government building for the state of California does have to do a life cycle analysis. And more recently, there is the Bay Area Load Concrete Code project where Marin County has created a code requirement to phase out high embodied carbon concrete. And finally, Vancouver is signing into law or policy that the city reduce its embodied carbon emissions by 40% by the year 2030. To date, I haven't seen anything in writing that's going to help these different jurisdictions meet these goals, but they are currently in place, or what I mean by that is I haven't seen anything that any kind of specific rule that architects or developers are going to have to follow to help meet these goals. The goals are just currently in place since they're relatively new. Certifications are also going to not create any laws tied to embodied carbon reduction, but they are bringing projects, or they are bringing embodied carbon into more project scopes. With LEED v4, points are awarded by doing a life cycle analysis, which is an embodied carbon calculation. And then LEED is also doing a great job on encouraging product-specific environmental product declarations, or EPDs. I know some of the people on the phone today are on the manufacturer side, and that they are creating these EPDs. They are huge in helping get some LEED points, or to reduce overall embodied carbon emissions, specifically on the concrete and steel side, especially if they're product specific to a specific plant. There are other certifications above, but what I've highlighted are the ones that are more common in the US. And so if all of that information hasn't given you enough kind of ammo to go up to your client and say, hey, let's look at embodied carbon because either one, you're signed on to meeting the Paris Climate Agreement, or two, you have a LEED project, or three, you have a commitment in general just to reduce your overall CO2 emissions. What can we do to help convince them to do embodied carbon calculations or life cycle analysis on your next project? And really it's just tied to helping them meet their carbon reduction goals as a corporation. And so your client or developer might have the question, what is the added cost to choose low embodied carbon products like concrete and steel? According to SCANSA and ULI, the upfront cost is pretty negligible. It's just because those EPDs are in general becoming more and more commonplace, and the manufacturer themselves, they're paying for that EPD. It's not at the cost of the developer or the client. And the way to take advantage of those EPDs and to reduce your overall embodied carbon emissions is to really look at the embodied carbon of your high stake materials like concrete and steel early on in the project. And you need to coordinate with contractor who's purchasing the products. You need to coordinate with your structural engineer who's specifying the kind of the performance standards of the concrete and steel very early on, so that as a team, you can make informed decisions on what products to incorporate in your project to make the greatest impact on embodied carbon reduction. And ULI has produced this very helpful guideline on the process of analyzing embodied carbon for your next project. And at the very top, it's breaking it up between if you're redeveloping or remodeling an existing building, or if you're building a new building. And so some things to highlight here to help educate client is that number one, you're going to want to consider if it's a new build, low carbon structural materials, because 80% of a building's embodied carbon is from structural materials. If you are working on a remodel project, you would want to consider more the repurposing of existing materials. So keeping that drywall at the core, or keeping as much ceiling tile as possible, as long as it's not damaged. Those all make a pretty significant impact on a remodel job's CO2 emissions, because you're not bringing in new product that is creating CO2 emissions just through the creation and transport. And then how to implement these strategies into the project is to spec low carbon products like concrete and steel, throw the requirements into the specifications, or also into the RFP. So the directive could come from the client saying, hey, we have an overall CO2 emissions goal as a corporation. We want you to look at embodied carbon to help us meet our annual goals. And so that's all about finding the right person or contact at the client side to incorporate that into the RFP or make them aware of the opportunity. And finally, what needs to happen is more projects need to share their success story about how they reduced embodied carbon, how they did it, and the impact that it had on their clients' CO2 reduction goals. And to close out, really the pitch here for any client is that all clients are looking at their carbon footprint one way or another. Some of them have CO2 reduction goals, some of them do not. But if your client has specific CO2 reduction goals, they're more than likely looking at their scope 3 emissions, and we just need to remember that embodied carbon falls under scope 3 emissions. It can help them meet their CO2 reduction goals as a corporation. What ESD has done is we've kind of looked at 28 Fortune 500 companies to see how many of the companies are already addressing embodied carbon, whether it's through an RFP requirement or within their annual reports. And what we found is that 6 of the 28, so 20% of those companies, are already addressing embodied carbon reduction, which is a pretty significant number, considering it is something so new to a lot of people. And in the future, I think that number is going to grow. I think that percentage is going to grow from 20% and higher. And really that's because back in January 2020, BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager, is really pushing for any company that they are representing become more sustainable. And that's because the demand in the future from the younger generations is that that generation is going to make their purchases based on sustainability and climate change, or they're going to choose where to work based on their values tied to climate change. So they're going to want to work for a corporation that is reducing their CO2 emissions to help meet the Paris Climate Agreement goals. And so BlackRock is getting ahead of this and being like, hey, if you want to be successful in the future, to all of these super large companies throughout the world, they're saying you really need to integrate sustainability measures into your overall objectives or your values. Otherwise, you might not be so successful in the future. So my experience is that I've worked with a data center client out in Virginia. And although these data centers consume a lot of energy, the client is still reporting annually their CO2 emissions, and they're looking at everything, including scope 3. And so during my monthly meetings with the sustainability director of this corporation, I'm like, hey, I know that you always want to pursue LEED Silver, and I also know that you have carbon reduction goals as a corporation every year. We can start looking at reducing your overall scope 3 emissions by taking embodied carbon into consideration. And after that discussion, the client or the sustainability director of the corporation is now jumping on the calls or on my lead calls with the designers and the project managers. And they're really driving the requirement to select more embodied carbon friendly construction materials. Without them on the phone or without the RFP requiring this sort of analysis, it would be more difficult, but because they found the right person at the corporate level to communicate the requirement, more of the project team and contractors are taking embodied carbon seriously. And so to wrap up, I know that today's presentation was pretty quick, but it is a webinar. We don't want it to be too long because it's going to be hard to keep your attention. But the takeaway here is that, or the things to remember, is that all new construction must be net zero carbon by 2050 to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. That embodied carbon can seriously help your client meet their overall carbon emissions goals. And that as buildings meet higher performance standards and the grid becomes greener, operational carbon will continue to decrease and embodied carbon will have more of an impact on total life cycle emissions. And so I hope you learned something today. Basically what I provided are 4 talking points for you to look at the start of your project to see how you best can convince your team to look at embodied carbon. But what I'd like to do now is just open it up to some poll questions, and then we'll go through some Q&A.
Thank you, Tim. Before anyone leaves, I encourage people to participate in these small polls that we're gonna try to have as part of a discussion. Normally we would like to do this in person, but obviously due to the circumstances, we're trying to adapt. So it's just a couple of quick questions. We just want to know exactly the audience, what's your experience. It's multiple choice, it's completely anonymous. So just take your time. Well, not all the time, but we're basically trying to understand more or less the audience we're talking to, and so that everyone else understands who also is participating in this. So we're gonna wait a bit more. Around 70% have voted. Just 10 more seconds. I don't really want to prolong this longer. Okay, so I'm gonna release the results. So basically, we can see that at least people here in the audience that participated are either somewhat familiar or feel comfortable discussing the topic. It's still something that hasn't really been considered in work, or people that haven't actually been working in, which is good. The first step that we want to do is having people being familiar or discussing the topic. That's amazing. So we have another poll. Oops, wait, this is the same one. So this one is just regarding your relationship between clients and embodied carbon. Has it come up? Is it something that you were interested in learning? Please vote so we can know what people think about it. we'll have like just 1 minute to see the results. Oh, wait, apparently people can't see the second poll. I'm gonna try it again. Does the second poll appear? Sorry, again, this is new for all of us. Oh. Okay, so I'm gonna go to this question. So this question then is can you see the poll now? Okay, perfect. So we'll go back to question 2 in a minute. Okay, so I'm gonna end the poll. So this question was a bit tricky. It was a very open-ended, but I feel like we all kind of share that sense of if policy really requires it, and if it's like a strong requirement, then the clients will have the motivation to discuss a conversation. But at the same time, I'm kind of I like that people already having those conversations. Around like 33% of the people already are having this, and that's really amazing. That's hopeful compared to only if policy will requires it. So now let's see if I can go back to question number 2. Is question 2 available? Can you see it? What is wrong with question 2, honestly?
There it is.
I'm gonna go with question 4 then. Is question 4 available? Okay, perfect. So with question 4, what we're trying to understand is exactly where to go with this local chapter in the future. We have several events planned already, but it's always good to have some feedback or some input of what people want to learn about, what they're interested in, just so that we understand what to provide or how to address it. So I give some time for everyone to respond. Okay, so apparently there's a big interest in LCA tools, low carbon materials. I mean, that's kind of what we expected. I'm actually going to take a screenshot of this because it's very useful. But beyond that, it's good to know what people think, what people want to know. And yeah, I think we're going to skip question 2 because I don't know why it keeps giving error. But it's good to understand what people want to know. I don't think we have any questions. If there's any questions or comments, any Q&A for Tim, just write them right now in the text box. If not, I think we can call it a day, unless Tim, do you want to say anything else?
To circle back on the first question of the poll, like, do you think your clients are going to be looking at embodied carbon? I think it's going to happen in the future, whether the client likes it or not. Number one is because of BlackRock being that huge investor in companies. BlackRock is going to start requesting that whoever they're investing in is reporting their CO2 emissions to be more sustainable. And then because of that, more clients are going to be looking at their CO2 emissions, specifically their scope 3 emissions, because most of the time it represents a larger percentage than energy consumption emissions. And so at the end of the day, you just had to find the right person at the client level to help you bring an LCA analysis into your project scope of work, because most RFPs right now are just focused on kind of just building the building by a certain deadline. And other than that, I usually don't have any questions. I hope I don't scare people.
So Tim, there's actually a question in the chat, is
Okay.
how can LEED and LBC do more to emphasize the importance of embodied carbon reduction in their standards? It seems that there's very few points currently available for embodied carbon, which is totally correct. Do you have any comment on that?
Unfortunately, I think if there were just more points tied to the overall CO2 emissions of materials, if that were to happen, then that would be helpful. I think
I
once the
agree.
lead, yeah.
Yeah, I agree that right now LEED doesn't really allocate as many points or give them a lot of importance. It has really changed from version 4 to version 4.1. But if you compare operational carbon to embodied carbon, there's really a huge imbalance in the dynamic. It also kind of reflects the industry right now. The industry is really focusing on operational carbon as a must. There's a lot of emphasis on that, which is amazing. But it really should be both, should be addressed. And yeah, maybe in the future, LEED or other organizations could give up as many points as they do. But yeah, like it is true that in the new versions of LEED from version 4 and version 4.1, they're really increasing the points of embodied carbon. As I think it's Scott that's putting it in the chat section. But
Yeah.
compared to operational carbon, there's a huge imbalance, and maybe it should be fixed in the future.
Yeah, and it is pretty hard even just to get 2 points under LEED v4.1. I don't know if they can, I don't know, I don't want to say make it easier, but yeah.
Tim, there's another question. I'm not sure if you can answer. Is there a way to use existing code frameworks like ASHRAE A189.1 to include embodied carbon requirements?
I think that's a great question. ASHRAE 189.1 isn't just energy consumption focus like ASHRAE 90.1 is. And so, yeah, I could see ASHRAE 189.1 bringing in some framework for embodied carbon reduction. I do not see it happening within like ASHRAE 90.1 or IECC 20 or IECC 2018 because it's just energy consumption related. And so what cities need to do is they need to look at adopting both an energy code and a general sustainability code.
Okay, that was really the last question. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Tim, for this presentation. It was very informative. Ideally, hopefully, we would like our next presentation to be in person again. That's how we like to do this kind of events. It's better to see people in the face. It allows for better discussion rather than flimsy polls on Zoom. But who knows with the situation how it will happen. But thank you all for coming. Thank you all for participating. Even if it was just through this medium, we know that it's not the most easiest way to engage in participation and discussion, but we really appreciate all of you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.